When I walked out of federal prison after 12 long years for a corporate fraud, I did not commit. I did not expect a welcome home parade. But I also never imagined that the moment I stood before the massive iron gates of the estate I built from absolutely nothing, I would look up and see my younger brother kissing my wife on the balcony of my own master bedroom. They had stolen my $50 million logistics empire. They had stolen my family. And they were living a life of absolute luxury built on my blood, my sweat, and my stolen freedom. I did not scream. I did not pound my fists against the iron gates. I simply pulled out a cheap prepaid phone, dialed my lawyer, and said it is time for justice. Before I tell you exactly how I tore their perfect little world apart piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that karma always comes to collect its debts. I am Alexander Pierce. I am 70 years old. For 12 years, my entire world was a concrete cell, a steel toilet, and the relentless echoing noise of a federal penitentiary. I was released 3 years early for good behavior. I did not call anyone to pick me up. I did not want them to know I was coming. The state gave me a bus ticket and a cheap, ill-fitting suit that smelled of mothballs and stale detergent. When the bus dropped me off at the edge of the affluent Chicago suburb where my estate was located, I decided to walk the last 5 miles. I needed that walk. I needed to feel the crisp autumn air in my lungs without razor wire blocking the sky. As my worn-out shoes hit the pavement, my mind raced back to the day everything collapsed. I had founded Pierce Global Logistics when I was 25. I started with one used delivery box truck and a ledger book I kept in the glove compartment. Over 30 years, I turned that single truck into a massive supply chain network spanning the entire country. I gave thousands of people jobs. I brought my younger brother Gregory into the fold when he could barely hold down a job as a bartender. I paid for his business degree. I made him my vice president, and my wife Diana. We had been married for 20 years. I gave her the world. A sprawling mansion, designer clothes, endless vacations. But when the federal agents raided my office 12 years ago, presenting fabricated offshore accounts and forged signatures that pointed directly to me, neither of them stood by my side. Diana filed for divorce while I was awaiting trial. Gregory took control of the board, claiming he needed to steady the ship. I was convicted, branded a thief, and locked away. The walk took me nearly 2 hours. My legs ached, a harsh reminder of my age and the toll prison had taken on my body. Finally, I stood before the massive wrought iron gates of the Pierce estate. The stone pillars I had imported from Italy stood tall and imposing. But there was a new addition. A sleek, modern security booth sat just inside the gates, manned by 2 young guards in sharp black uniforms. They were laughing at something on a smartphone. I stepped up to the call box and pressed the button. The loud buzzing sound echoed. One of the guards looked up, his smile vanishing, as he saw an old man in a cheap, dusty suit standing on the other side of the iron bars. He pressed the intercom button. "Can I help you, buddy? The neighborhood is private property. No soliciting allowed." His voice was laced with that specific kind of arrogance that comes from protecting someone else's wealth. I looked at him, my expression completely flat. "Open the gate. I am Alexander Pierce. This is my home." The 2 guards exchanged a look before bursting into laughter. "Sure thing, old man," the first guard said, leaning closer to the microphone. "And I am the mayor of Chicago. Now step away from the gate before we call the local police and have you arrested for loitering. Go find a shelter." I did not argue. 12 years in a cell teaches you that arguing with fools is a massive waste of breath. I simply turned away from the call box. The guards went back to their phones, dismissing me completely. I walked along the perimeter wall, tracing my bare hand over the cold stone until I reached a thick section of overgrown English ivy. I pulled the dense vines aside, revealing a small, weathered metal panel set flush into the brickwork. 15 years ago, when the security system was first installed, I insisted the contractors wire a hardline manual override box. I wanted a fail-safe in case of a total power grid failure. Gregory never knew about it. Diana certainly did not care about the technical details of the house. I flipped the metal cover open. The keypad was covered in dust, but the green power light was still faintly glowing. I punched in a 6-digit code, the birth date of my late mother. A soft mechanical click sounded from inside the pillar. Behind me, the massive iron gates began to groan. The heavy motorized hinges whirred to life, and the gates slowly swung inward, parting wide open. I stepped back onto the driveway. The 2 security guards jumped out of their booth, their faces pale with absolute shock. They grabbed their radios, staring at the open gates, completely bewildered. "Hey!" the first guard yelled, reaching for his heavy-duty belt. "How did you do that? Stop right there!" I did not even look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the winding tree-lined driveway ahead of me. "I am going to my house," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous authority. "If you touch me, you will be looking for a new job in exactly 5 minutes. Call your boss. Tell him the ghost is back." They froze, unsure of what to do as I walked past them. The crunch of gravel beneath my cheap shoes sounded like a slow countdown. The landscaping was absolutely immaculate. I recognized the ancient oak trees I had meticulously preserved during the initial construction. But as I rounded the final bend and the main house came into full view, the breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks. Up on the second-floor balcony, the balcony connected to my master bedroom, stood 2 figures, Gregory and Diana. They were holding crystal champagne flutes, laughing together in the crisp afternoon sun. Gregory leaned in and kissed her. It was not a friendly peck. It was the kiss of a man who owned her, who owned everything that used to be mine. My stomach churned a toxic mix of revulsion and sheer unadulterated fury. The quiet rumors I had heard through the prison grapevine were true. They had not just stolen my company to save it. They had stolen my life. They were a couple. I tore my eyes away from the balcony and walked up the grand marble steps to the front door. It was unlocked. They felt so incredibly secure behind their iron gates and paid guards that they did not even bother locking their own front door. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped into the grand foyer. The familiar scent of polished wood and expensive floral arrangements hit me a sharp contrast to the smell of rust and bleach I had lived with for over a decade. But the house felt alien. The soul of the place had been gutted and replaced. Above the sweeping grand staircase, there used to be an enormous oil painting. It was a beautiful portrait of Diana and me, commissioned for our 15th wedding anniversary. I looked up at that wall. My portrait was gone. In its place hung a massive, professionally framed photograph of Gregory and Diana on their wedding day. They were smiling radiantly, holding hands on a pristine white beach. The reality of their betrayal crashed over me in a suffocating wave. They had completely erased me from existence. I was not just a convicted brother or an estranged husband. I was deleted. I stood in the center of the marble floor, staring up at the wedding photo, when I heard the sharp click of high heels at the top of the stairs. I turned my head slowly. Diana was walking down the steps, holding an empty wine glass. She was wearing a silk designer dress, her hair perfectly styled. She looked exactly as she had 12 years ago, preserved by vast wealth and a complete lack of a guilty conscience. She was looking down at her phone, humming a soft, cheerful tune. She reached the middle landing before she finally looked up. Her eyes locked onto mine. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale wax mannequin. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the marble staircase and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. The loud crash echoed through the cavernous foyer, a violent disruption of their perfect quiet life. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently it barely sounded human. "Alex, how are you here?" Before I could answer, heavy footsteps sounded from the hallway above. "What was that? Diana, did you drop something?" Gregory appeared at the top of the stairs. He was wearing casual slacks and a tailored cashmere sweater. He jogged down a few steps before he stopped abruptly. He saw the shattered glass. Then he saw me. Gregory gripped the mahogany handrail so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. His eyes widened in absolute panic. For a fleeting moment, the wealthy, arrogant chief executive officer vanished, replaced by the terrified younger brother who used to beg me for money to pay off his gambling debts. But the panic only lasted a second. He forced his face into a mask of calm composure, though his breathing was visibly heavy. He slowly walked down the rest of the stairs, stepping carefully around the broken glass, and stood directly next to his wife. I did not look at his face. My eyes dropped to his left wrist. Poking out from beneath the sleeve of his expensive cashmere sweater was a watch. A very specific custom-engraved vintage Patek Philippe watch. I stared at it for a long, heavy, silent moment. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it could suffocate us all. Finally, I spoke. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "I bought that watch in Geneva, Gregory," I said, never taking my eyes off his wrist. "I bought it to celebrate the day our company hit its first $10 million in revenue. I wore it every single day until the federal agents took it as evidence." "Tell me, does it feel heavy on a trader's wrist?" Gregory swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He instinctively pulled his sleeve down to cover the watch, taking a defensive step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Diana. He plastered a fake, patronizing smile on his face, signaling to the security guards who were now running through the open front door behind me. I knew exactly what he was about to do. He was about to spin a lie. He was about to tell me this was all a tragic misunderstanding, and I was going to let him. The sound of laughter drifted down from the second-floor balcony, sharp and clear in the crisp autumn air. It was a familiar sound, a sound I had spent 12 years trying to forget, in the deafening silence of my concrete cell. I stopped dead in my tracks, my worn-out shoes digging into the immaculate gravel driveway. Up on the terrace, connected directly to my master bedroom, stood two figures, Gregory and Diana. They were holding crystal champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the ghost standing below them. Gregory leaned in and kissed her. It was not a brief, friendly kiss. It was the kiss of a man who owned her, who owned everything that used to belong to me. My stomach churned a toxic mix of revulsion and pure, unadulterated fury. The quiet rumors I had heard through the prison grapevine were absolutely true. They had not just stolen my logistics empire to save it. They had stolen my entire life. I tore my eyes away from the balcony and walked up the grand marble steps leading to the front entrance. The massive oak doors were unlocked. They felt so incredibly secure behind their iron gates and paid guards that they did not even bother securing their own home. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the grand foyer. The familiar scent of polished mahogany and expensive floral arrangements hit me a sharp contrast to the smell of rust and bleach I had breathed for over a decade. But the house felt entirely alien. The soul of the place had been gutted and meticulously replaced. Above the sweeping grand staircase, there used to be an enormous oil painting. It was a beautiful portrait of Diana and me commissioned to celebrate our 15th wedding anniversary. I looked up at that wall. My portrait was completely gone. In its place hung a massive, professionally framed photograph of Gregory and Diana on their wedding day. They were smiling radiantly, holding hands on a pristine white beach. The cold reality of their ultimate betrayal crashed over me in a suffocating wave. They had completely erased me from existence. I was not just a convicted brother or an estranged husband. I was deleted. I stood frozen in the center of the marble floor, staring up at the wedding photo, when I heard the sharp, rhythmic click of high heels at the top of the stairs. I turned my head slowly. Diana was walking down the steps, holding an empty wine glass. She was wearing a pale silk designer dress, her hair perfectly styled. She looked exactly as she had 12 years ago, preserved by vast wealth and a complete lack of a guilty conscience. She was looking down at her phone, humming a soft, cheerful tune. She reached the middle landing before she finally looked up. Her eyes locked onto mine. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale wax mannequin. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the marble staircase and shattered into 100 glittering pieces. The loud crash echoed through the cavernous foyer, a violent disruption of their perfect quiet life. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently it barely sounded human. "Alexander, how are you here?" Before I could answer, heavy footsteps sounded from the hallway above. "What was that, Diana? Did you drop something?" Gregory appeared at the top of the stairs. He was wearing casual slacks and a tailored cashmere sweater. He jogged down a few steps before he stopped abruptly. He saw the shattered glass. Then he saw me. Gregory gripped the mahogany handrail so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. His eyes widened in absolute panic. For a fleeting moment, the wealthy, arrogant chief executive officer vanished, replaced by the terrified younger brother who used to beg me for money to pay off his gambling debts. But the panic only lasted a second. He forced his face into a mask of calm composure, though his breathing was visibly heavy. He slowly walked down the rest of the stairs, stepping carefully around the broken glass, and stood directly next to his wife. I did not look at his face. My eyes dropped to his left wrist. Poking out from beneath the sleeve of his expensive cashmere sweater was a watch. A very specific, custom-engraved vintage Patek Philippe watch. I stared at it for a long, heavy, silent moment. The silence in the room was so thick, it felt like it could suffocate us all. Finally, I spoke. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. "I bought that watch in Geneva to celebrate our first $10 million, Gregory." I kept my eyes locked firmly on the golden dial resting against his skin. "It looks incredibly heavy on the wrist of a traitor." Gregory swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He instinctively pulled his sleeve down to cover the watch. He took a defensive step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Diana, attempting to project an air of dominance that he simply did not possess. For a moment, he looked like a cornered animal searching for an escape route. But then the shock began to fade, slowly replaced by a sickening sense of absolute confidence. He stood taller, squaring his shoulders. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He raised his right hand and snapped his fingers twice, a sharp, echoing sound that sliced through the tension. He was signaling his private security team, the men he paid, with the wealth of another, to protect my estate. I heard the heavy front doors creak open behind me as the two guards rushed inside. "Now that is no way to speak to your family, Alexander," Gregory said, his tone laced with a toxic, mocking sympathy. "We were just surprised, that is all. We thought you were locked away for another 3 years. It is a shame you did not call ahead." I did not turn around to look at the guards standing behind me. I kept my eyes fixed squarely on the man who had orchestrated my utter ruin. He believed he held all the cards. He believed the millions of dollars in the bank and the hired muscles standing at my back gave him absolute power. He was about to weave a brilliant tapestry of lies. He was about to look me in the eye and claim he only took control of my life work to save it from total financial collapse. He would likely try to offer me pathetic crumbs from my own dining table, hoping I was broken enough to accept them. I stood absolutely still, maintaining my dangerously calm demeanor, as the guards stepped closer, their hands resting heavily on their weapon belts. I knew exactly what my traitorous brother was about to do. He was about to spin a pathetic lie. He was about to tell me this was all a tragic misunderstanding. And I was going to silently stand right there and let the arrogant, pathetic fool speak his mind before destroying him completely forever. The two massive security guards stepped cautiously into the grand foyer, their hands hovering nervously over their heavy duty belts. They looked directly at Gregory, waiting for a firm command to drag me out into the autumn air and toss me off the property like common trash. Gregory raised his right hand, gesturing smoothly for them to stand down and back away into the shadows. His false smile widened completely, transforming his rigid features into a practiced mask of pure benevolence. He took another step forward, closing the physical distance between us, acting as though 12 long years of stolen life were nothing more than a brief misunderstanding between siblings. He looked at me with an expression of profound, sickening pity, the exact kind of condescending look a wealthy benefactor gives a homeless man shivering helplessly on the street corner. "You really have to understand the terrible situation we were put in, Alexander." He began, his deep voice dripping with heavily practiced sincerity. "When the federal agents took you away in handcuffs, the entire company was in absolute freefall. The board of directors panicked immediately, calling emergency meetings to oust our family completely. Our stock prices plummeted overnight, wiping out 3 decades of hard work in a matter of hours. We were bleeding millions of dollars by the minute, and our fiercest corporate rivals were circling like hungry vultures preparing for a ruthless, hostile takeover. They wanted to dismantle your beautiful logistics network piece by piece, fire all your loyal employees without severance, and sell the remaining hard assets for scrap metal. I had to make incredibly difficult choices to save your legacy from total annihilation." Gregory reached out and gently placed his hand on the small of Diana's back. She leaned into his touch, playing her tragic role perfectly. "The only way to stop the financial bleeding was to legally consolidate our voting shares." He continued, his tone smooth and sickeningly convincing. "Diana and I had to present a united front to the terrified shareholders and the aggressive media. We had to get married on paper to merge our assets and legally block the corporate raiders from acquiring a controlling stake in the boardroom. We did not do this out of malice or petty greed. We did this specifically for you, Alexander. We sacrificed our own personal reputations just to protect the massive empire you built with your bare hands. We kept the executive seat warm so that one day when this horrible nightmare was finally over, you would still have a functional, profitable company to return to. We were your saviors in the darkest hour." Diana took a hesitant, measured step forward, her high heels clicking softly against the pristine marble floor. She raised a trembling hand to her cheek, carefully wiping away a perfectly timed tear that threatened to ruin her immaculate makeup. "Oh, Alexander, it was so incredibly hard for us," she whispered, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "The financial press was absolutely ruthless, dragging our good name through the mud every single day. Our closest friends abandoned us overnight. I was entirely alone in this massive house, terrified, isolated, and absolutely heartbroken watching you go away to federal prison. I needed a strong, familiar shoulder to lean on during the absolute darkest period of my life. Gregory was the only person in the world who stayed to help me pick up the shattered pieces. We bonded deeply over our shared grief and our mutual love for you. It was genuinely never supposed to happen this way, but we had to do whatever it took to survive the storm. You must know deep down how much it profoundly pained us to make these desperate choices. I stood there listening to their pathetic, highly rehearsed performance without moving a single muscle. It was a brilliant, highly plausible lie crafted by expensive corporate public relations consultants and ruthless defense attorneys to sound like the ultimate noble sacrifice. They were painting themselves as heroic martyrs who had bravely thrown themselves onto a live grenade just to save my life's work from destruction. If I had been the exact same man I was 12 years ago, the naive, overly trusting brother and devoted husband, who blindly loved his family without question, I might have fallen for their poisonous trap. I might have wept with gratitude, dropped to my knees, and embraced them both for saving my company. But 12 brutal years in a high-security federal penitentiary burns away every single ounce of foolish naivety a man possesses. It forcefully teaches you to look past the smoothly spoken words and strictly observe the silent, desperate truths hidden within the subtle body language of professional liars. I kept my facial expression completely blank, presenting a slate of cold, unreadable stone. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for an eternity, forcing them to sit uncomfortably in the echoing aftermath of their deceitful monologue. I did not scream about the staggering injustice of my false conviction. I simply watched them breathe. I watched the tiny beads of nervous sweat begin to form along Gregory's hairline despite the cool air of the mansion. I watched the subtle twitch in his jawline as my prolonged, unnerving silence began to deeply crack his projected armor of absolute confidence. But it was Diana who truly gave their sinister game away. As she offered me another tearful, trembling smile playing the role of the deeply sorrowful bride, my eyes drifted downward. While her face projected an image of profound tragedy, her hands told an entirely different, vastly more revealing story. She was holding a small, expensive designer purse. Her knuckles were stark white, her fingers gripping the soft leather strap with desperate intensity. She was squeezing the purse so hard that her manicured nails were digging deep into the expensive material, leaving permanent crescent-shaped indentations. She was physically bracing herself, her entire body rigid, with a suppressed anxiety that she could barely contain. As she wept her fake tears, I noticed she was shifting her body weight backward, completely avoiding direct eye contact with me. Every time her gaze flickered, she would immediately look away, staring intensely at the marble floor, the staircase, or the blank wall behind me. She could not look me in the eye. It was not the nervous guilt of a woman who had simply moved on to find comfort in the arms of another man during a tragic separation. It was the soul-crushing terror of a guilty conspirator standing face to face with the ghost she had personally helped to murder in cold blood. She was absolutely terrified of me. In that brief moment of careful observation, staring at her white-knuckled grip on that purse, my gut fiercely confirmed what my mind already suspected. This was not a desperate rescue mission to save a failing company. It was a flawlessly executed, highly premeditated, hostile takeover of my entire existence. But I was not broken. I was reborn in the absolute darkest fires imaginable. The silence stretched across the grand foyer, heavy and absolute. I did not offer them the forgiveness they were pretending to seek. I did not scream my innocence or curse their betrayal. I just stood there, letting the quiet weight press down on their shoulders. Gregory, however, completely misinterpreted my absolute stillness. He looked at my worn-out suit and tired eyes. He did not see a man calculating his next strategic strike. He only saw a broken, defeated ghost who had lost his entire world. A man who had spent 12 years stripped of his power, his wealth, and his voice. Gregory mistakenly believed he had won. He believed I was completely crushed beneath the sheer magnitude of their fabricated reality. A sickening smile crept back onto his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored cashmere sweater and pulled out a thick silver money clip. He deliberately peeled off 20 crisp $100 bills. He took 3 steps forward and carelessly tossed the wad of cash onto the polished surface of the glass coffee table between us. The money landed with an insulting thud. "I know you have absolutely nothing left to your name, Alexander," Gregory said, his voice dripping with a toxic mixture of pity and superiority. "The state seizes everything when you are convicted of massive corporate fraud. But Diana and I have talked about this extensively. We agreed that it would be incredibly cruel to simply cast you out onto the street. You are still my brother after all. We want to give you a second chance to rebuild some small semblance of a life." I looked down at the money resting on the glass table. $2,000. It was a fraction of what I used to spend on a casual weekend dinner. It was a calculated, deliberate insult masquerading as an act of profound family charity. "We cannot give you a position in the corporate office." Gregory continued pacing slowly across the marble floor, with his hands clasped behind his back. "The board of directors would absolutely panic if a convicted felon was seen anywhere near the executive suites. The public relations fallout would be utterly disastrous for our stock prices. But we still own the old Southside facility. You know the one. The dilapidated warehouse by the river that we use for long-term low-priority storage. The security perimeter there is outdated, and we need a reliable night watchman to patrol the grounds and log the gate entries. The pay is minimum wage, but it comes with basic health benefits and a uniform." Gregory stopped pacing and looked me directly in the eyes, his smirk growing wider. "It is the absolute best a convicted felon can get in this economy, Alexander. You should consider yourself incredibly lucky. We are even offering you a way to earn an honest living. Most companies would throw your application directly into the garbage. Diana stepped forward, her hands still tightly gripping her designer purse. "We just want to help you get back on your feet," she added, her voice soft and placating. "We arranged for you to stay in the old groundskeeper cabin behind the main estate gardens. It is small, but it has a bed and a working heater. You can stay there rent-free until you save up enough money from your night shifts to find a cheap apartment in the city." The sheer audacity of their proposal echoed in my mind. They had stolen my $50 million empire, taken over my sprawling mansion, and were now graciously offering me a minimum wage job guarding a decaying warehouse while allowing me to sleep in a glorified garden shed on my own property. My chest burned with a raging inferno of anger. Every single instinct I possessed screamed at me to step forward, grab Gregory by his cashmere sweater, and beat the absolute truth out of him right there in the foyer. But I was not a creature of foolish impulse. 12 years in a concrete cell teaches a man the supreme value of emotional discipline. I realized instantly that Gregory, in his arrogant attempt to humiliate me, had just handed me the master key to his ultimate destruction. He was giving me unfiltered, unmonitored access to the company properties during the dead of night. He was handing me the exact tool I needed to dismantle his fraudulent empire from the inside out, so I swallowed my remaining pride. I took a slow, trembling breath, forcing my shoulders to slump forward. I let my head bow, breaking eye contact, physically projecting the image of a completely shattered man who had finally accepted his pathetic fate. I made my hands shake slightly as I reached out toward the glass coffee table. I picked up the $100 bills, clutching them tightly to my chest, like a desperate beggar receiving his final meal. "Thank you, Gregory," I whispered, keeping my voice low and heavily textured with fake defeat. "Thank you, Diana. I know I do not deserve your kindness after everything that has happened. I will take the job. I will not cause you any trouble. I just want a quiet place to sleep and a chance to work." The visible wave of relief that washed over their faces was absolutely pathetic. Gregory let out a very long, arrogant sigh, completely satisfied with his total dominance. Diana relaxed her grip on her purse, finally believing the ghost had been permanently laid to rest. "I am glad you are finally being reasonable," Alexander Gregory said, turning his back on me to walk toward his beautiful wife. "The security team will escort you to the cabin out back. Your shifts at the warehouse start tomorrow at midnight. Do not be late." The two massive security guards stepped forward, their hands resting on my shoulders to guide me out of my own home. I did not resist. I let them march me across the manicured lawns past the beautiful rose gardens I had planted for Diana until we reached the far edge of the property line. The groundskeeper cabin was exactly as they described. A dingy, decaying wooden shed that smelled strongly of damp earth and rotting timber. The guards unlocked the rusted padlock, shoved me inside, and pulled the door shut behind me, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. I stood in the exact center of the cramped, unheated room. The single dirty window let in a sliver of pale moonlight. I slowly straightened my posture. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The pathetic, defeated old man they saw in the foyer evaporated into the cold night air. I reached into the lining of my cheap, ill-fitting suit and pulled out a small black burner phone. I pressed a single programmed number and raised the device to my ear, listening to the dial tone ring twice before a familiar gravelly voice answered on the other end. "Alexander," the deep voice said. "Bradley." I replied, my voice steady, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. "I am inside. I have the job. They bought every single second of the performance. Let the games begin." The damp cold of the groundskeeper cabin seeped deep into my bones the exact moment I ended the call. I placed the small black burner phone carefully beneath a loose floorboard, hidden under the rusted iron radiator, making sure it was completely out of sight. For the next 24 hours, I fully embraced the humiliating role Gregory had meticulously crafted for me. When the sun rose the following morning, I walked across the sprawling estate grounds with a slow, shuffling gait, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the grass whenever Diana or the private security guards passed by. I was a ghost haunting my own property, a pathetic cautionary tale they could safely ignore and mock. By nightfall, they loaded me into the back of a windowless company van and drove me out to the Southside facility. The warehouse was a towering monolith of corrugated steel and cracked concrete that I had originally purchased 30 years ago when the company was just beginning to expand. It was supposed to be fully decommissioned and sold off last year. Gregory had clearly kept the building operational for deeply guarded reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate efficiency or standard logistics. The night manager was a heavy-set, impatient man with a permanent scowl who handed me a stained uniform jacket and a heavy, scratched flashlight. He spoke to me incredibly slowly, articulating his harsh words as if I were a dim-witted child, explaining the basic perimeter routes and the manual gate logs. I nodded submissively, asking remarkably foolish questions to completely cement his total lack of respect for my intellect. I shuffled along the rusted chain-link fence, loudly rattling padlocks and slowly signing my name on the yellowed paper ledger at the drafty security kiosk. To the manager and the few exhausted warehouse workers smoking cigarettes outside the loading bays, I was just a broken old man, pathetically grateful for a meager paycheck. But the absolute moment their backs were turned, my eyes stopped wandering blindly and my posture straightened with rigid purpose. I was no longer a minimum-wage watchman, blindly wandering the perimeter. I was the supreme architect of this entire logistics network, and I knew every single blind spot, structural flaw, and logistical loophole in the entire building. For the first 3 nights, I simply stayed in the shadows and watched the flow of operations. The rhythm of a logistics hub is exactly like a heartbeat to me, an intricate, predictable symphony of arriving inventory processing barcode scans and departing outbound freight. But by the middle of the 4th night, my finely tuned instincts began to violently scream. A deep, unsettling gut feeling warned me that the operational rhythm here was completely artificial. The primary loading docks facing the main street were loudly moving standard wooden pallets of cheap consumer goods, acting as a noisy, highly distracting facade for anyone watching from the outside. The real operation was happening at the rear loading bays, deliberately hidden behind a tall, concrete retaining wall that fully shielded the area from the main road. I quietly adjusted my patrol route, slipping silently into the dark, narrow shadows between the towering stacks of discarded wooden pallets. I stood perfectly still, controlling my breathing, watching the rear bays. Exactly at 3 in the morning, the heavy steel bay doors rolled up with a quiet, mechanical hum. A fleet of 3 unmarked matte black trucks reversed smoothly into the loading zone. These were not standard commercial freight vehicles by any stretch of the imagination. There were no corporate logos, no visible registration numbers, and absolutely no regulatory compliance stickers on the heavy reinforced rear doors. The suspension systems on the trucks were heavily modified, sagging slightly under immense concentrated weight, despite the relatively small physical size of the cargo containers. As the drivers stepped out into the dim amber light, I immediately noticed they were not wearing standard union uniforms. They wore dark tactical clothing and moved with the silent, rigid, hyper-aware discipline of private military contractors. I watched from the darkness as they efficiently loaded heavy reinforced steel crates into the back of the vehicles without speaking a single word to each other. Using my intimate knowledge of regional transit routes and highway infrastructure, I mentally calculated their precise departure time and their directional heading. They were leaving the city through the old crumbling industrial access roads, a highly inefficient winding route that deliberately bypassed every single federal way station and highway inspection checkpoint in the county. They were moving untraceable contraband right under the nose of the federal government. I waited patiently in the freezing shadows until the unmarked trucks finally pulled away, their dim taillights fading silently into the thick, rolling Chicago fog. The warehouse crew immediately rolled the steel bay doors back down, casually returning to their mundane tasks, as if absolutely nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. I crept out of the dark pallets, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I needed solid physical proof to bring Gregory down. I moved silently toward the rear dispatch office, a small glass-enclosed room that sat completely empty during the graveyard shift. The door was locked, but the cheap commercial handle was absolutely no match for a simple tension tool I had fashioned from a heavy-duty paperclip I found on the floor. I slipped inside the dark office, careful not to disturb the thick layer of dust on the desks. The wastebasket beneath the main computer terminal was mostly empty, save for a few crumpled coffee cups and a single partially shredded piece of thick cardstock paper that had narrowly missed the actual shredder bin. I carefully pulled the torn document from the trash and smoothed it out flat on the wooden desk, using a very narrow beam from my flashlight to selectively illuminate the faded text. It was a secondary shipping manifest deliberately printed on off-ledger paper to completely avoid the digital corporate tracking systems and audits. The cargo description was intentionally vague, listed only as high-density recycled paper materials originating from a mysterious overseas holding company. But I immediately recognized the specific weight classifications, the highly customized container dimensions, and the required international customs bypass codes stamped securely at the very bottom of the page. This was not recycled paper. It was not imported electronics or heavy industrial machinery. My breathing hitched slightly in the dark as the horrific, undeniable reality of Gregory's ultimate betrayal finally crystallized in my mind. The heavy steel crates loaded onto those unmarked trucks were packed to the brim with millions of dollars in untaxed illicit overseas cash. I stood frozen in the silent office, staring at the physical proof of his devastating crimes. He had not just stolen my logistics empire to play the wealthy businessman. He was actively using my life's work to launder staggering amounts of dirty money for dangerous international syndicates. If the federal authorities discovered this illegal operation, they would seize every single remaining asset and permanently destroy my legacy forever. I carefully folded the manifest and smiled. The long hunt had officially started now. By the time my graveyard shift ended, I carefully returned the torn shipping manifest to the exact position I found it in the wastebasket. For the next 3 weeks, I settled into a grueling, exhausting routine. I slept for a few hours in that damp, unheated groundskeeper cabin. During the day, I played the part of the broken, subservient ghost whenever Gregory or Diana were nearby. I shuffled my feet. I kept my eyes cast downward. I spoke in a quiet, trembling voice that completely masked the burning inferno of vengeance building inside my chest. My performance was so flawlessly pathetic that Gregory quickly grew bored of simply ignoring me. He wanted to actively humiliate me. On the morning of my 4th week, the night manager approached me. He shoved a plastic bucket of cheap cleaning supplies into my chest. "The cleaning crew called in sick today," he grunted, pointing a thick finger toward the main corporate tower. "Mr. Pierce wants his private executive office spotless before the board members arrive at noon. He specifically requested that you handle the detailing. Do not touch anything on his desk, old man. Just empty the trash, vacuum the carpets, and polish the glass." I took the bucket with a trembling hand. I rode the private elevator up to the 40th floor. I slowly pushed open the heavy oak double doors leading into the primary office, the room that had been my sanctuary for over 20 years. Gregory had completely eradicated every single trace of my existence from the room. My antique mahogany desk had been replaced by a cold, modern slab of frosted glass and polished steel. The walls, once lined with photographs of my early delivery trucks and my loyal founding employees, were now decorated with pretentious, meaningless modern art. Now I was standing here in a stained, oversized uniform, holding a bottle of cheap glass cleaner and a dirty rag. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a cold, calculating focus. I turned away from the window and began to methodically vacuum the floor. I was emptying the heavy brass wastebasket near the leather guest sofas when the oak doors suddenly swung open. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer high heels echoed across the room. I immediately stopped moving, keeping my head bowed low, playing the part of the invisible servant. Diana walked into the office carrying a sleek leather briefcase and a steaming cup of expensive coffee. To her, I was just a nameless piece of background furniture, a minimum-wage laborer, entirely unworthy of her attention. She walked briskly to the glass desk, set her coffee down, and began organizing a stack of financial reports. I continued my work slowly, wiping down the edge of the leather sofa, keeping my breathing steady and perfectly controlled. Then a sudden, blinding flash of light caught my eye. The morning sun was streaming brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching something resting against the smooth skin of her neck. I subtly shifted my angle, raising my eyes just a fraction of an inch to see what had reflected the light so fiercely. Diana was wearing a tailored white silk blouse unbuttoned slightly at the collar. Resting perfectly against her collarbone, suspended by a delicate chain of white gold, was a massive, pear-shaped diamond. But it was not just any diamond. It was a flawless, incredibly rare blue diamond pendant, surrounded by a custom halo of smaller, brilliant cut stones. My hands instantly stopped moving over the leather sofa. The dirty cleaning rag slipped slightly from my grip, but I caught it before it hit the carpet. I stared at the blue diamond, my heart hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs. I knew that specific necklace intimately. I had personally commissioned that exact piece of jewelry over 15 years ago from a master jeweler in Antwerp. It was a highly customized, one-of-a-kind creation, designed specifically to match the exact shade of Diana and her striking blue eyes. I had given it to her on our 10th wedding anniversary. But the sheer beauty of the necklace was not what caused the breath to catch painfully in my throat. It was the horrific, devastating history attached to it. 12 years ago, during the most brutal phase of my federal fraud trial, the prosecutors needed to prove that I was secretly hoarding massive amounts of illicit wealth to fund my supposed embezzlement schemes. They needed a smoking gun to convince the skeptical jury that I was a greedy, remorseless criminal mastermind hiding assets. Diana had taken the witness stand in a crowded federal courtroom, crying those same beautiful manufactured tears she had shed in my foyer. Under oath, she had looked directly at the jury and testified that I had violently ripped that specific blue diamond pendant from her neck during a terrible argument. She swore under penalty of perjury that I had secretly sold the rare necklace on the black market to fund my illegal offshore accounts. Her emotional, devastating testimony was the final nail in my coffin. The jury believed the story of the terrified, heartbroken wife whose greedy husband had pawned her most treasured anniversary gift to cover his criminal tracks. That single lie had guaranteed my conviction and my 12-year sentence. Yet here it was, resting comfortably against her skin in the bright morning light. The blue diamond had never been sold on the black market. It had never been pawned to fund a non-existent embezzlement scheme. She had simply hidden it away in a safe deposit box, waiting patiently for the dust of my destroyed life to settle. Seeing that necklace proved something far more sinister than a simple corporate takeover. It proved that Gregory and Diana had premeditated my total downfall long before the federal agents ever knocked on my office door. They had meticulously planned every single lie hiding the necklace to fabricate the exact evidence the prosecutors needed. They had deliberately engineered the entire collapse just to steal the throne for themselves. The sheer magnitude of their cold-blooded betrayal washed over me, but I did not look away. I stared at the blue diamond, completely mesmerized by the physical proof of my innocence wrapping around her neck like a shimmering, undeniable confession. The intensity of my gaze must have broken through on her arrogant obliviousness. Diana suddenly stopped organizing the financial reports. She stiffened, slowly turning her head to look across the spacious office. Her eyes locked directly onto mine. For a split second, the wealthy, confident executive wife faltered. She saw me staring directly at the stolen anniversary gift she had used to lock me in a concrete cage. A flash of genuine panic crossed her features. She instinctively reached up, clutching the blue diamond tightly, trying to conceal it from my view. Her panic morphed into a vicious, defensive rage. "What do you think you are looking at, you pathetic old man?" she spat, taking an aggressive step toward me. "If I ever catch you staring at me or my jewelry again, I will have Gregory fire you immediately." I let the silence hang, then I simply smiled. After leaving the corporate tower, the profound satisfaction of seeing the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating in Diana's eyes successfully fueled me through the rest of the grueling day. I finished my miserable shift, keeping my head bowed low, playing the silent janitor perfectly. But as midnight approached, I slipped away from the estate grounds, moving invisibly through the freezing autumn rain. I purposefully took 3 different, incredibly slow public bus lines, deliberately winding my way through the massive labyrinth of the dark city to ensure I was absolutely not being followed. I finally stepped off the bus on the far west side of Chicago, a decaying industrial neighborhood where the streetlights barely worked and the shadows swallowed everything whole. My destination was a dilapidated 24-hour diner, tucked beneath the rusted steel tracks of the elevated train. The flickering neon sign hanging directly above the front door was half broken, buzzing constantly with a persistent, annoying hum. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The diner smelled heavily of stale coffee, cheap cooking grease, and damp wool. It was completely empty except for a single patron sitting in the furthest, darkest corner booth nursing a black coffee. I slowly walked over and smoothly slid into the cracked vinyl booth directly across from him. Bradley Lawson looked exactly the same as he did 12 years ago, perhaps just a little grayer at the temples. He was a brilliant, incredibly ruthless corporate attorney who had been my most trusted advisor since the very beginning of my career. He was the only man who had never doubted my innocence, the only one who had tirelessly fought my doomed legal battles while the rest of the world turned their backs on me. Bradley did not offer a warm smile or a friendly handshake. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his dark trench coat and slid a heavy padded manila envelope across the sticky laminate table. I kept my hands resting flat on the table, maintaining a perfectly calm exterior as I looked at the package. Inside that envelope were 3 encrypted high-capacity drives. They contained the massive trove of internal corporate data I had successfully extracted from the main server room during my previous night shifts. Bradley had spent the last 48 hours running the raw, chaotic data through a highly secure private forensic accounting firm he trusted with his life. I watched as he took a slow, measured sip of his bitter coffee, his dark eyes scanning the empty diner, before finally locking onto mine. "You were absolutely right about the off-ledger shipping manifests." Alexander Bradley said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper barely audible over the rattling hum of the passing train above us. "The financial forensics completely confirmed your worst suspicions. Gregory is not just managing a few shady under-the-table transit routes to boost his quarterly profit margins. He has effectively turned the entire secondary logistics network into a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering machine for international syndicates. But that is not even the worst part." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. "Tell me," I said quietly. Bradley opened a heavily redacted file folder he had kept hidden beneath his coat. He slid a single highly classified corporate document toward me. It was a preliminary acquisition agreement. Gregory is actively preparing to sell Pierce Global Logistics to a massive, aggressive foreign conglomerate known as Apex Holdings. Bradley explained, his tone laced with a deep, simmering anger. "He has been negotiating this hostile buyout in absolute secrecy for the past 6 months. Apex Holdings is incredibly eager to absorb your proprietary supply chain infrastructure to establish a dominant foothold in the domestic market. They are offering a completely cash-funded buyout, $100 million. The final binding signatures are scheduled to be executed in the main executive boardroom exactly next Friday at noon." My blood ran completely cold. Gregory was not just content with stealing my life and parading around with my wife. He was systematically dismantling the empire I had built with my bare hands, preparing to sell the bones to the highest bidder for a massive unearned payout. "And once the ink on that contract dries," Bradley continued, leaning closer across the table, "Gregory and Diana are gone." We traced a series of highly complex, staggered wire transfers, leaving the primary corporate accounts over the past 3 weeks. They are secretly funneling the company's liquid cash reserves into untraceable offshore trusts. They have already purchased one-way Private charter flights scheduled to depart from a secondary airfield less than 2 hours after the acquisition is finalized. Their final destination is a sovereign island nation with absolutely no extradition treaties with the United States government. If they sign that contract next Friday, they will vanish into thin air with over $100 million, and you will be left standing in the ashes with absolutely nothing. The sheer breathtaking magnitude of their final exit strategy hung heavily in the stale diner air. They had calculated every single variable, meticulously engineering the ultimate untouchable escape. I stared down at the acquisition document, my jaw tightening, as a cold, lethal focus settled deep into my mind. I reached out to take the envelope containing the encrypted drives ready to launch a full-scale assault on their operation. But Bradley suddenly slammed his hand down firmly on top of the envelope, stopping me instantly. His expression grew incredibly grim, the lines on his face deepening with profound concern. "You need to listen to me very carefully," Alexander Bradley warned, his voice dropping to a deadly serious register. "You cannot simply storm into that boardroom and accuse them of these crimes. You cannot go to the federal authorities with a handful of stolen server data and expect them to immediately arrest a prominent, wildly successful chief executive officer. You are a recently released, highly monitored parolee with a major federal fraud conviction permanently attached to your name. Gregory possesses almost unlimited financial resources, deep political connections, and a massive team of the most ruthless defense attorneys money can buy. If you interfere with this sale without bulletproof, undeniable, catastrophic proof of their original conspiracy, Gregory will not just deny the allegations. He will completely destroy you. He will claim you violated your parole by illegally accessing secure corporate mainframes and attempting to extort him. He will use his wealth and influence to ensure your parole is instantly revoked. If you make a single misstep, if you give him even a fraction of an opening, you will be thrown back into a maximum security concrete cell for the rest of your natural life, and this time you will never ever see the sky again." I looked at Bradley, fully absorbing the absolute terrifying reality of his grim warning. The margin for error was completely non-existent in this dangerous game. I slowly pulled my hand back from the sticky table, locking my eyes fiercely with his. "I simply am not going back to a cage, Bradley," I said, my voice remarkably steady and absolutely cold. "I am going to build one for them." I stepped out of the diner and into the freezing Chicago rain, pulling the collar of my cheap coat up against the wind. The metallic clatter of the elevated train faded behind me as I walked back toward the bus station. The encrypted drives sat heavy in my pocket, a silent promise of the reckoning to come. The next evening, I returned to the groundskeeper cabin just before my shift began. I had exactly 4 hours before I needed to clock in at the main corporate tower. Gregory had demanded that the executive floors be meticulously detailed before the end of the week, inadvertently giving me the perfect cover to roam the restricted levels. But getting onto the executive floor was only the first step. The primary server room, which housed the physical backup drives for the entire logistics network, was located on the 39th floor. It was secured by a heavy steel door, a standard physical deadbolt, and a highly sophisticated magnetic keypad. I sat on the edge of my cot and opened a small metal toolbox I had scavenged from the maintenance shed. Using a pair of wire cutters, a discarded copper grounding wire, and the lithium battery from a broken digital radio, I carefully fashioned a localized electromagnetic shorting device. It was a crude old-school technique, but it was highly effective against the specific brand of commercial magnetic locks Gregory had installed a decade ago. I slipped the homemade tool into the deep pocket of my janitorial uniform and walked out into the biting wind to begin my shift. The corporate tower was practically a ghost town by the time the clock struck 2 in the morning. The skeletal night crew was entirely confined to the lower loading bays, and the roaming security patrols operated on a very predictable 45-minute rotation. I pushed my heavy yellow cleaning cart onto the service elevator, pressing the button for the 39th floor. The elevator hummed quietly as it ascended, the soft mechanical vibration mirroring the steady, controlled rhythm of my own heartbeat. When the polished metal doors slid open, I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I pushed the cart past the empty glass offices. I stopped directly in front of the server room. It was a windowless, fortified bunker tucked away at the very end of the corridor. I glanced up at the small security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. I reached into my cleaning bucket, grabbed a spray bottle of thick industrial foam cleaner, and casually sprayed a heavy, opaque layer directly over the camera lens. To anyone watching the monitor in the security room downstairs, it would simply look like a careless janitor aggressively polishing the upper molding. I quickly pulled out my master set of janitorial keys and unlocked the physical deadbolt with a quiet, satisfying click. Now came the difficult part. The magnetic keypad glowed with a dull red light, demanding a 6-digit authorization code. I pulled my homemade copper bypass tool from my pocket. I carefully jammed the exposed wire ends into the tiny gap between the keypad housing and the steel door frame, pressing the lithium battery firmly against the connection points. A sharp, localized spark hissed in the quiet hallway. The red light on the keypad flickered violently for 3 agonizing seconds before suddenly turning a solid, welcoming green. The heavy magnetic seal disengaged with a deep thud. I pushed the door open and slipped inside, pulling it shut behind me. The server room was freezing cold, completely filled with the deafening, continuous roar of massive cooling fans. Rows of towering black server racks blinked with thousands of tiny blue and green lights, processing the endless flow of global logistics data. I walked directly to the primary administrative terminal sitting in the center of the room. I tapped the keyboard, waking the dual monitors from their sleep state. The system immediately demanded an executive login credential. Gregory was arrogant, but he was also incredibly predictable. I typed in the name of his first childhood pet, followed by his anniversary date. The screen flashed red, indicating an incorrect password. I paused, taking a slow, calming breath. I thought about the man he had become, the unyielding arrogance that fueled his every decision. I typed in his own name, followed by the word 01. The system unlocked instantly. I pulled the 3 encrypted drives Bradley had given me from my pocket and plugged them directly into the mainframe ports. I opened the hidden archival directories, bypassing the superficial quarterly reports, and dug straight into the restricted offshore financial folders. There they were. 12 years of deeply buried, highly classified corporate secrets. I found the staggered wire transfers, the shadow accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the exact digital trail of the illicit overseas cash flowing through my clean logistics network. I also found the archived internal emails between Gregory and Diana detailing their meticulous, cold-blooded strategy to frame me over a decade ago. I highlighted the entire massive directory and initiated the secure transfer. A gray progress bar appeared on the screen, calculating the immense volume of data. It estimated 7 minutes for completion. I stood perfectly still in the freezing room, watching the percentage climb with agonizing slowness. 10%, 30%. The roar of the cooling fans seemed to grow louder, drowning out all other sounds in the building. I constantly checked my watch, knowing the security patrol would begin their upward sweep in exactly 12 minutes. 50%. The data flowing into those drives was the undeniable, catastrophic proof that would completely dismantle Gregory's fraudulent empire and restore my stolen life. 80%. I clenched my jaw, willing the digital transfer to move faster. 95%. The progress bar finally hit 100% with a soft chime. I immediately ejected the drives, shoving them securely into my inside jacket pocket. I quickly locked the terminal, ensuring absolutely no trace of my digital intrusion remained on the screen. My heart pounded a relentless rhythm against my ribs as I turned away from the racks. I had everything I needed to completely destroy them. I approached the heavy steel door and pressed my ear against the cold metal, listening intensely for any movement in the corridor. The hallway was perfectly silent. I gripped the handle gently, pushed the door open, and stepped back out onto the plush carpet. I turned to pull the door shut, allowing the magnetic seal to lock itself with a heavy click. I exhaled a quiet breath of relief and reached for my cleaning cart. Then a harsh, blinding beam of light suddenly struck me directly in the face. I froze, completely exposed in the dark. "Well, look what we have here," a deep, menacing voice echoed down the corridor. The head of corporate security stepped out of the shadows, resting his hand firmly on his weapon. "I think the chief executive officer is going to be very highly interested to know exactly why his little janitor is sneaking out of the server room tonight." The blinding beam of the tactical flashlight hit me directly in the eyes. I raised a hand to shield my face from the glare, but I did not take a single step backward. The head of corporate security stepped out of the shadows. He was an intimidating man with a deeply scarred jawline. He kept one hand firmly planted on his holstered weapon while keeping the bright light pinned aggressively on my face. "Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You are a long way from the warehouse floors, old man. I highly doubt my boss requested the server room to be vacuumed at 2 in the morning." I lowered my hand slowly, allowing my eyes to adjust. I could feel the cold weight of the encrypted drives resting securely in the inside pocket of my cheap uniform jacket. If he decided to search me right now, 12 years of patient waiting would be instantly destroyed. He would confiscate the drives and hand me over to the police for violating my federal parole. "I am just doing the job I was assigned," I said, keeping my voice deliberately submissive. "Mr. Pierce wanted the entire floor detailed before the board meeting." "I apologize for the confusion." The security chief let out a harsh laugh and took another intimidating step forward. "Do not play stupid with me, you pathetic old ghost," he sneered, lowering the flashlight just enough so I could see the malicious gleam in his dark eyes. "I know exactly who you are. Gregory warned me all about you. And now I catch you sneaking out of the primary server room in the dead of the night. You really thought you could pull a fast one on me?" He pulled a heavy radio from his belt, his thumb hovering over the transmission button. "I am going to call the authorities right now," he continued, thoroughly enjoying his moment of absolute power. "Then I am going to call Gregory and personally tell him I caught you trying to steal from him again. You are going back to prison tonight." He was fully expecting me to drop to my knees and beg. Instead, I slowly straightened my spine. The artificial submissive slouch I had carefully maintained for a month completely vanished. I looked him directly in the eyes, with a gaze so cold and piercing that his thumb hesitated over the radio button. "I would strongly advise against making that call," I said, my voice dropping its trembling facade and taking on the sharp, commanding resonance of the chief executive officer I truly was. "Because if the authorities arrive tonight, I am not the only one leaving in handcuffs." The security chief paused, his heavy brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What kind of desperate garbage are you talking about?" he demanded. I reached into the deep pocket of my janitorial uniform. I moved my hand slowly, pulling out the small burner phone I had hidden in the groundskeeper cabin. I unlocked the screen and opened a specific video file I had recorded over the past 3 weeks. I held the glowing screen up so he could see it clearly. During my first week working the graveyard shift at the warehouse, I told him smoothly, I noticed a very interesting discrepancy in the high-value inventory logs. Luxury goods were disappearing from the cages before loading. It took me exactly 2 nights of patient observation from the dark shadows of the loading dock to figure out exactly who was orchestrating the massive theft. I tapped the play button on the phone screen. The night vision footage clearly showed him backing his personal vehicle up to a blind spot near the secondary loading doors. It showed him using his master security keycard to bypass the warehouse alarm system. It showed him physically loading 4 heavily reinforced crates of stolen luxury merchandise directly into his trunk before speeding away into the night. The heavy tactical flashlight slipped slightly in his grip. The arrogant sneer completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden sickening wave of pure terror. "You have been systematically robbing this company blind for at least 6 months, I continued, my voice echoing quietly off the executive corridor walls. That is grand larceny, interstate commerce theft, and corporate embezzlement. Gregory might be an arrogant fool, but he is a deeply ruthless and unforgiving man when it comes to his money. What do you think he will do to you when I show him this video?" He will use his expensive lawyers to completely destroy your life. You will be sitting in a federal prison cell long before the sun rises tomorrow morning. What do you want? He whispered, his voice trembling with genuine fear. You want money, we can work together. I lowered the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I do not want your stolen pocket change, I said, staring at him with absolute contempt. I want absolute loyalty, and I want it right now. You are going to become my personal eyes and ears inside this building. You are going to look the other way whenever I need to access a restricted floor. You are going to wipe the security camera footage from tonight. If you do exactly as I say, I will permanently delete this video. But if you try to cross me, I will send this footage directly to the local police department before you can even blink. He stood paralyzed in the hallway, carefully weighing his extremely limited options. He recognized the cold, unyielding authority in my voice. He knew I was not making an idle threat. Okay, he finally breathed out, lowering his flashlight completely and taking a deeply submissive step backward. Okay, you win. I will do whatever you want. Just do not show that video to anyone. I will wipe the camera logs right now. I nodded slowly, satisfied with his total capitulation. Good, I replied. Now, prove your loyalty. Gregory has been holding highly secretive closed-door meetings all week. I want his private schedule for the next 7 days. The security chief did not hesitate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of stationery. He handed it to me. That is his personal executive itinerary, he whispered. He is meeting with a group of foreign investors next Friday at noon in the main boardroom. He ordered us to double the guard detail. I took the folded paper, feeling a fierce surge of adrenaline. The pieces of my ultimate revenge were finally falling into perfect alignment. I had the encrypted data confirming their massive money laundering operation, and now I had the exact time of their escape plan. I slipped the itinerary into my pocket. Go back down to your security desk, I ordered him. Erase the tapes, and remember you work strictly for me now. I pushed my cleaning cart toward the service elevator, leaving him completely unaware of the massive storm approaching fast. I pushed my cleaning cart onto the elevator, leaving the terrified security chief frozen behind me. The metal doors slid shut, sealing me inside the descending box. My heart pounded a steady rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was clear. I had extracted the trove of corporate data, neutralizing the only physical threat between me and the exit. When my shift concluded at dawn, I did not return to the damp cabin. I boarded a city bus traveling into downtown Chicago. Bradley was waiting inside a windowless conference room at his law firm, sipping black coffee. I placed the drives onto the table. Bradley plugged them into a customized laptop, disconnected from all external networks. The decryption software hummed to life, unpacking 12 years of corporate secrets I had stolen from the server room. We sat in the suffocating silence, watching the progress bar fill the screen. When the digital vault cracked open, a staggering labyrinth of off-ledger financial transactions, hidden routing numbers, and encrypted communications flooded the monitors. We spent the next 7 hours combing through the overwhelming data. Gregory had been incredibly careful to mask his illicit logistics operations, burying the money laundering codes beneath layers of mundane corporate expenditures. However, as Bradley ran a forensic algorithm across the recovered executive email archives, a specific deeply buried subfolder caught my attention. It was a restricted directory labeled with a single unassuming letter. I leaned closer to the screen, instructing Bradley to open the file. Inside was a detailed digital ledger documenting massive wire transfers originating from the primary accounts exactly 12 years ago during my federal fraud trial. The money had been routed through a complex web of shell companies in the Cayman Islands before landing in a private trust fund. I stared at the name listed as the primary beneficiary, Richard Mercer. The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Richard Mercer had been my brilliant, highly trusted chief financial officer during the early expansion years of the company. When federal authorities raided my headquarters and charged me with embezzlement, Mercer drove the final nail into my coffin. He had taken the witness stand in that crowded courtroom, looked directly at the jury, and sworn under oath that I had personally ordered him to falsify the quarterly tax records to hide my non-existent offshore accounts. His emotional, incredibly convincing testimony was the bedrock of the prosecution's case. After the judge handed down my devastating 12-year sentence, Mercer abruptly resigned from the company, claiming his reputation was ruined by the scandal. He supposedly vanished into a quiet, modest retirement, completely disappearing from the corporate world. But the glowing ledger on the screen told a wildly different, infinitely more sinister story. Gregory had not just seamlessly taken over my logistics empire after I was convicted. He had actively, deliberately purchased my conviction. The wire transfers clearly proved that Gregory had paid Richard Mercer exactly $5 million to commit blatant perjury on the witness stand and destroy my entire life. I felt a cold, calculated fury rising deep within my chest, burning away the lingering remnants of the broken old man I had been pretending to be. "We have him," I whispered, my voice tight with dangerous energy. "This is the undeniable proof of their original conspiracy." Gregory paid his star witness to fabricate the entire fraud case. If we bring this ledger to the federal authorities, we can definitively prove my innocence and expose Gregory as the true architect of the financial collapse. Bradley shook his head slowly, his expression grim and analytical. "This digital ledger is a massive breakthrough, Alexander," he cautioned, leaning back in his chair. "But a 12-year-old offshore banking record obtained through an unauthorized server breach is not enough to overturn a federal conviction or guarantee an arrest warrant for a connected executive. Gregory's high-priced defense attorneys will argue the document was fabricated. To completely destroy Gregory and ensure he faces maximum prison time, we do not just need the banking records. We need the physical man himself. We need Richard Mercer to openly confess his perjury on a verified legal recording." I stared at the screen, processing the daunting reality of his legal assessment. "Where exactly is Mercer now?" I asked, my tone hardening with absolute resolve. Bradley rapidly typed commands into the laptop, cross-referencing routing numbers from the Cayman Islands with global property databases. He spent 5 tense minutes running digital traces before a satellite image populated the right monitor. It displayed a massive luxury estate located in an exclusive gated community on the vibrant coast of Miami, Florida. The property featured a private dock, an enormous infinity pool, and a sprawling golf course. "It appears your old friend Richard Mercer did not embrace a modest retirement after ruining your life," Bradley stated, his voice laced with heavy disgust. "He used his $5 million blood money payout to purchase a tropical fortress in Miami. He has been living like a king for the past 12 years while you were rotting in a concrete cell. He feels entirely safe. He believes the past is completely buried, and the ghost of Alexander Pierce is permanently locked away in the dark." I reached out and slowly traced my finger across the glowing satellite image of the sprawling Florida estate. The sheer injustice of Mercer living in tropical luxury while I had lost my company, my freedom, and my wife was a bitter pill to swallow. But I did not let anger cloud my strategic judgment. I knew exactly what needed to be done. Mercer was the ultimate vulnerable weak point in Gregory's seemingly impenetrable armor. If I could shatter Mercer, the entire fraudulent empire would violently collapse. "We have exactly 4 days before Gregory signs that massive buyout contract with the foreign investors next Friday," I said, turning away from the monitor to look directly at Bradley. "We need him to confess, and we need him to do it before Gregory and Diana board their private flight and vanish into a non-extradition country forever. We need to apply overwhelming pressure to a man who believes he is utterly untouchable." Bradley closed the laptop with a sharp snap. He pulled out his personal phone and opened a highly encrypted travel application. "I will book 2 first-class tickets under secure corporate aliases right now," he said, his dark eyes shining with the fierce anticipation of the coming battle. "We will leave Chicago tonight and touch down in Miami before dawn. Mercer is going to have a very unexpected, deeply unpleasant reunion this weekend." I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my cheap janitorial jacket. The pathetic disguise felt heavier than ever, but I knew I had to maintain the quiet illusion. I looked out the large glass window, watching the rain wash over the gray city streets below. "Pack your bags, Bradley," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, unforgiving promise of absolute retribution. "The ghost is heading south for the weekend, and it is finally time to wake the dead." The flight to Miami was a blur of dark clouds and turbulent air mirroring the storm building inside my chest. We touched down just as the oppressive Florida sun began to bake the tarmac. Bradley had arranged a private car to take us directly to the exclusive marina where Richard Mercer kept his floating palace. Walking down the sun-bleached wooden docks, the smell of expensive sunscreen and sea salt filled the air. It was a completely different world from the rusting iron bars and concrete walls I had known for 12 years. We stopped in front of a massive gleaming white yacht. The name painted on the hull in arrogant gold lettering was the Safe Harbor. I felt a bitter smile pull at the corners of my mouth. Mercer actually believed he had found a safe harbor built on my ruined life. There were no security guards on the dock. Mercer felt utterly invincible in his wealthy sanctuary. Bradley and I stepped aboard our shoes, completely silent, on the polished teak deck. We found him lounging on the aft deck under a wide canvas canopy, wearing expensive linen trousers and sipping a colorful cocktail. He was staring out at the turquoise water, looking older, but comfortably padded by millions of stolen dollars. I stepped fully into his line of sight, blocking the morning sun. It took him 3 long seconds to process what he was seeing. When his brain finally registered my face, his cocktail glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the expensive wood, just like Diana had done with her wine glass in my foyer. "Richard," I said quietly, my voice slicing through the warm tropical breeze, "you look like you have seen a ghost." He scrambled backward in his lounge chair, his face turning an absolute sickening shade of gray. "Alexander," he choked out, his eyes darting frantically around the empty deck as if looking for a place to run. "How did you find me? What are you doing here?" I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I simply walked over and sat down in the plush deck chair directly across from him. "I did not come all the way to Miami to throw you overboard, Richard," I said, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "Though I assure you the thought crossed my mind extensively over the last 12 years. I came here to warn you." Bradley stepped forward, pulling a thick manila folder from his briefcase and tossed it onto the glass table between us. Mercer stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive. "Gregory is selling the logistics network to Apex Holdings next Friday for $100 million, Bradley stated, his tone clinically detached. "It is a massive, strictly scrutinized international acquisition. A buyout of that magnitude requires a completely spotless financial audit from the federal government before the ink can dry." Mercer swallowed hard, his hands trembling violently. "What does that have to do with me?" he stammered. "I left the company a decade ago." "You left the company, but you did not erase your digital footprints," I replied smoothly. "When Gregory cleans the corporate books for the federal auditors, he cannot simply delete the $5 million he embezzled to buy your perjury. That money has to be accounted for. So Gregory is currently restructuring the historical financial archives to classify that $5 million as an unauthorized executive theft. He is framing you, Richard. He is handing the Internal Revenue Service a perfectly fabricated paper trail that proves you solely orchestrated the offshore accounts. When he boards his private jet next week with his new fortune, the federal agents will be kicking down the door of this beautiful yacht. You are his sacrificial lamb." Mercer grabbed the folder and frantically flipped through the documents. He saw the doctored ledgers Bradley had extracted from the server, clearly showing Gregory shifting the criminal liability directly onto his shoulders. The color drained completely from his face as the crushing reality of Gregory and his ultimate betrayal washed over him. "He used you to destroy me," I said softly, leaning closer across the glass table. "And now he is using you to secure his final escape. You know exactly how ruthless my brother is. Do you really think he would leave a loose end like you living comfortably in Miami? You have exactly 2 choices, Richard. You can sit here on your boat and wait for the federal agents to arrive, Or you can give me the weapon I need to destroy him before he signs that contract. If you help me, I will ensure your name is completely redacted from the data breach before we hand it over to the authorities. You can keep your stolen retirement, but I need the absolute truth right now." Mercer dropped the papers onto the table, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. The wealthy, untouchable facade completely crumbled, leaving behind a terrified, desperate coward. He pressed his trembling hands against his face, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. "Gregory is a monster," he whispered, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "He promised me I would be safe forever. He promised the offshore accounts were completely untraceable. Promises from a traitor mean absolutely nothing," I stated coldly. "Give me the weapon, Richard. Give me the proof I need to bury him, or I swear I will walk off this yacht and let the federal government take everything you own." Mercer looked at me, his eyes wide with fearful realization. He slowly stood up on shaky legs and walked toward the luxurious cabin interior. Bradley and I followed him closely, our footsteps silent on the expensive hardwood flooring. Mercer led us into a private climate-controlled study below deck. He walked over to a beautiful mahogany bookshelf, removed a thick, leather-bound encyclopedia, and revealed a small, hidden wall safe. He entered a quick combination, his fingers slipping twice before the heavy steel door finally clicked open. He reached inside the safe and pulled out a small, antiquated digital audio recorder. It was an old model, the kind used for corporate dictation over a decade ago. He held it out to me, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the floor. "I did not trust Gregory even back then," Mercer confessed, his voice barely above a desperate whisper. "I knew he was perfectly capable of turning on me if the fraud trial went completely wrong. So, I secretly recorded the meeting where we finalized the plan. It is all right there on that device. Gregory and Diana explicitly plotting to forge the financial documents, explicitly planning to hide the blue diamond, and explicitly agreeing to pay me $5 million to lie on the witness stand under oath." I reached out and took the cold plastic recorder from his trembling fingers, feeling the heavy, profound weight of my stolen freedom resting securely in my palm. The final piece of the devastating puzzle was now mine. I turned toward the cabin door, leaving Mercer behind. "It is time to go home, Bradley. The ghost is finally awake now." The private jet flight back to Chicago was entirely silent. I sat in the plush leather seat staring out the window at the endless, massive ocean of dark clouds below the digital audio recorder, resting heavily in my jacket pocket. I had listened to the tape exactly once, hearing Gregory and Diana coldly calculate the exact phrasing of their perjury, laughing, as they debated which specific offshore account would look the most incriminating when the federal agents found it, had triggered a violent, suffocating rage inside me. But I did not let that burning anger consume my strategic focus now. Anger makes a man careless, and I could absolutely not afford a single mistake. I locked those toxic emotions away into a cold, tightly sealed vault deep within my mind. We touched down just as the pale morning sun began to bleed through the heavy urban smog. Bradley took a private car back to his law firm to securely duplicate the audio files and prepare the final lethal legal trap. I took a crowded city bus back to the decaying groundskeeper cabin, changed into my stained janitorial uniform, and walked right back into the very center of the cold nightmare. For the next 3 days, I continued to push my heavy yellow mop bucket across the pristine marble floors of the corporate tower. I perfected the exhausting, humiliating illusion of the entirely broken old man. I allowed my shoulders to slump even further. I let my hands tremble visibly whenever the wealthy executives walked past me in the wide corridors. I made absolutely sure that I was nothing more than a pathetic, invisible piece of background scenery. Gregory had to feel incredibly powerful, completely unchallenged, and utterly safe. The more arrogant he felt, the more absolutely blinding his overconfidence became. On Wednesday afternoon, the head of corporate security, the man I had successfully blackmailed into becoming my inside mole, quietly stopped me in the quiet hallway. He did not make eye contact, simply brushing past my shoulder and whispering a strict instruction to report immediately to the primary executive suite. Gregory had spilled coffee on his expensive Persian rug and demanded that I clean it up personally. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and rode the private elevator up to the 40th floor. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, Gregory was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. He was aggressively barking complex financial orders into his wireless headset. Diana was sitting on the leather sofa across the spacious room, casually flipping through a glossy fashion magazine. I kept my head bowed low, shuffling silently toward the large dark stain on the intricate rug near the front of his massive steel and glass desk. I dropped heavily to my knees, taking a damp sponge and a plastic bottle of carpet cleaner from my cleaning bucket. I began to rigorously scrub the thick fabric, making my breathing sound extremely harsh and incredibly labored for their total arrogant viewing pleasure. Gregory finally finished his phone call and carelessly tossed the expensive headset onto the glass desk. He turned around, looking down at me kneeling on the floor at his feet. A slow, deeply cruel smile spread across his handsome face. He walked over and stood so close that the polished tips of his imported Italian leather shoes were practically touching my knees. "You missed a spot right there, Alexander," he said, his deep voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Scrub a little harder. The board of directors is arriving here in exactly 1 hour for a very critical financial presentation today. I cannot have the office smelling like stale coffee and cheap industrial soap when they walk through those huge doors," he added maliciously. I nodded submissively, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the damp carpet. "Yes, Gregory," I mumbled, forcing my voice to sound weak, raspy, and entirely defeated. "I will make sure it is perfectly clean." Diana let out a soft, mocking sigh from the leather sofa. "Honestly, Gregory," she complained loudly, turning a heavy page in her magazine, "I do not understand why you even bother keeping him around here. It is just profoundly depressing to watch him. He moves so incredibly slow," she finished, entirely dismissing my humanity. Gregory let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. "Oh, do not worry, my beautiful love," he replied confidently, crossing his arms over his chest. "He will not be an eyesore for much longer." He looked right back down at me, clearly savoring the malicious blow he was about to deliver to a defenseless man. "You see, Alexander, the board of directors, and I had a highly productive meeting this morning. We finalized a major real estate optimization strategy to increase our liquid assets. We are officially liquidating the Southside facility. The heavy demolition crews are scheduled to arrive next Monday at dawn to tear the entire warehouse down to the concrete foundation," he announced proudly. He paused for a moment, letting the devastating implication of his cruel words hang heavily in the cold, perfectly air-conditioned room. He wanted me to fully realize that he was completely destroying the only pathetic, miserable sanctuary he had supposedly offered me in his manufactured charity. "Which means your little minimum wage security job is officially terminated," he continued, his dark tone turning remarkably vicious and utterly, completely devoid of any lingering, familial warmth. "And since we are selling the main residential estate grounds to a private commercial developer next month, the groundskeeper cabin is going to be completely bulldozed as well. So I highly suggest you pack your meager belongings this weekend. I am sure there is an open cot available at a public shelter downtown, assuming you get there early enough to wait in the long line outside the soup kitchen." The sheer absolute cruelty of his grand plan was breathtaking to witness firsthand. He had seamlessly stolen my entire $50 million logistics empire and washed millions in illicit overseas cash. He was actively preparing to flee the country with his newfound fortune. Yet he still felt the compulsive, sadistic need to ensure that I was cast out onto the freezing winter streets with absolutely nothing. He desperately wanted to watch me suffer one final time before he vanished forever. I kept my head bowed low, squeezing the damp sponge tightly in my trembling hands. "I understand, Gregory," I whispered, perfectly projecting the ultimate image of total, crushing despair. "I will pack my things today. Thank you for letting me stay as long as you did on the massive estate property." He let out a loud, victorious scoff, finally turning his back on me to walk toward Diana. As he turned away to pour them a glass of sparkling water, my trembling hands instantly steadied. The facade of the broken old man completely evaporated, I smoothly reached into my uniform pocket. Hidden inside my palm was a microscopic listening device. I slid my hand silently beneath the thick steel edge of his desk, pressing the adhesive backing firmly into a hidden groove. The trap was set. Let him boast now. I smiled coldly, knowing his entire world was about to collapse. The private jet flight back to Chicago was entirely silent. I sat in the plush leather seat staring out the window at the endless, massive ocean of dark clouds below the digital audio recorder resting heavily in my jacket pocket. I had listened to the tape exactly once. Hearing Gregory and Diana coldly calculate the exact phrasing of their perjury, laughing as they debated which specific offshore account would look the most incriminating when the federal agents found it, had triggered a violent, suffocating rage inside me. But I did not let that burning anger consume my strategic focus now. Anger makes a man careless, and I could absolutely not afford a single mistake. I locked those toxic emotions away into a cold, tightly sealed vault deep within my mind. We touched down just as the pale morning sun began to bleed through the heavy urban smog. Bradley took a private car back to his law firm to securely duplicate the audio files and prepare the final lethal legal trap. I took a crowded city bus back to the decaying groundskeeper cabin, changed into my stained janitorial uniform, and walked right back into the very center of the cold nightmare. For the next 3 days, I continued to push my heavy yellow mop bucket across the pristine marble floors of the corporate tower. I perfected the exhausting, humiliating illusion of the entirely broken old man. I allowed my shoulders to slump even further. I let my hands tremble visibly whenever the wealthy executives walked past me in the wide corridors. I made absolutely sure that I was nothing more than a pathetic, invisible piece of background scenery. Gregory had to feel incredibly powerful, completely unchallenged, and utterly safe. The more arrogant he felt, the more absolutely blinding his overconfidence became. On Wednesday afternoon, the head of corporate security, the man I had successfully blackmailed into becoming my inside mole, quietly stopped me in the quiet hallway. He did not make eye contact, simply brushing past my shoulder and whispering a strict instruction to report immediately to the primary executive suite. Gregory had spilled coffee on his expensive Persian rug and demanded that I clean it up personally. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and rode the private elevator up to the 40th floor. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, Gregory was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. He was aggressively barking complex financial orders into his wireless headset. Diana was sitting on the leather sofa across the spacious room, casually flipping through a glossy fashion magazine. I kept my head bowed low, shuffling silently toward the large, dark stain on the intricate rug near the front of his massive steel and glass desk. I dropped heavily to my knees, taking a damp sponge and a plastic bottle of carpet cleaner from my cleaning bucket. I began to rigorously scrub the thick fabric, making my breathing sound extremely harsh and incredibly labored for their total arrogant viewing pleasure. Gregory finally finished his phone call and carelessly tossed the expensive headset onto the glass desk. He turned around, looking down at me kneeling on the floor at his feet. A slow, deeply cruel smile spread across his handsome face. He walked over and stood so close that the polished tips of his imported Italian leather shoes were practically touching my knees. "You missed a spot right there, Alexander," he said, his deep voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Scrub a little harder. The board of directors is arriving here in exactly 1 hour for a very critical financial presentation today. I cannot have the office smelling like stale coffee and cheap industrial soap when they walk through those huge doors," he added maliciously. I nodded submissively, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the damp carpet. "Yes, Gregory," I mumbled, forcing my voice to sound weak, raspy, and entirely defeated. "I will make sure it is perfectly clean." Diana let out a soft, mocking sigh from the leather sofa. "Honestly, Gregory," she complained loudly, turning a heavy page in her magazine, "I do not understand why you even bother keeping him around here. It is just profoundly depressing to watch him. He moves so incredibly slow," she finished, entirely dismissing my humanity. Gregory let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. "Oh, do not worry, my beautiful love," he replied confidently, crossing his arms over his chest. "He will not be an eyesore for much longer." He looked right back down at me, clearly savoring the malicious blow he was about to deliver to a defenseless man. "You see, Alexander, the board of directors, and I had a highly productive meeting this morning. We finalized a major real estate optimization strategy to increase our liquid assets. We are officially liquidating the Southside facility. The heavy demolition crews are scheduled to arrive next Monday at dawn to tear the entire warehouse down to the concrete foundation," he announced proudly. He paused for a moment, letting the devastating implication of his cruel words hang heavily in the cold, perfectly air-conditioned room. He wanted me to fully realize that he was completely destroying the only pathetic, miserable sanctuary he had supposedly offered me in his manufactured charity, which means your little minimum wage security job is officially terminated. He continued his dark tone, turning remarkably vicious and utterly completely devoid of any lingering familial warmth. "And since we are selling the main residential estate grounds to a private commercial developer next month, the groundskeeper cabin is going to be completely bulldozed as well. So I highly suggest you pack your meager belongings this weekend. I am sure there is an open cot available at a public shelter downtown, assuming you get there early enough to wait in the long line outside the soup kitchen." The sheer absolute cruelty of his grand plan was breathtaking to witness firsthand. He had seamlessly stolen my entire $50 million logistics empire and washed millions in illicit overseas cash. He was actively preparing to flee the country with his newfound fortune. Yet he still felt the compulsive, sadistic need to ensure that I was cast out onto the freezing winter streets with absolutely nothing. He desperately wanted to watch me suffer one final time before he vanished forever. I kept my head bowed low, squeezing the damp sponge tightly in my trembling hands. "I understand, Gregory," I whispered, perfectly projecting the ultimate image of total, crushing despair. "I will pack my things today. Thank you for letting me stay as long as you did on the massive estate property." He let out a loud, victorious scoff, finally turning his back on me to walk toward Diana. As he turned away to pour them a glass of sparkling water, my trembling hands instantly steadied. The facade of the broken old man completely evaporated. I smoothly reached into my uniform pocket. Hidden inside my palm was a microscopic listening device. I slid my hand silently beneath the thick steel edge of his desk, pressing the adhesive backing firmly into a hidden groove. The trap was set. Let him boast now. I smiled coldly, knowing his entire world was about to collapse. I pulled my hand back smoothly, making absolutely sure not a single trace of the adhesive was visible beneath the thick steel lip of his executive desk. I grabbed my sponge, stood up with a perfectly executed groan of manufactured pain, and tossed it into my yellow cleaning bucket. I did not look at Gregory or Diana again. I simply bowed my head and shuffled out of the luxurious office, letting the heavy oak doors click shut behind me. The long walk back to the crumbling groundskeeper cabin felt entirely different tonight. The biting Chicago wind whipped against my thin uniform jacket, but I did not feel the cold. I felt the electric surging current of absolute anticipation. Once I was securely locked inside the damp wooden shed, I dropped to my knees and pulled up the loose floorboard hidden beneath the rusted radiator. I took out my secondary burner phone and the small, highly sophisticated digital receiver Bradley had procured for me. I plugged a cheap black pair of wired headphones into the audio jack and turned the volume dial up. For the first few hours, the receiver only broadcast the mundane ambient noises of the executive suite. I heard the faint scratching of a designer pen against paper, the soft clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and the muffled, arrogant tone of Gregory barking orders at his terrified assistants. I sat on the edge of my rigid cot, staring blankly at the rotting wooden wall, listening to the man who stole my life pretend to be a titan of industry. The next morning, the real performance began. I kept the earpiece hidden beneath my collar, routing the thin black wire down my back, so I could monitor his office in real time while pushing my mop across the lower lobby floors. Gregory spent the entire Thursday morning obsessively reviewing the final merger documents with his compromised legal team. He was frantic, aggressively double-checking the staggered wire transfer protocols that would funnel the $100 million buyout directly into his untraceable offshore accounts. He was completely blinded by his own impending victory, entirely focused on his grand escape to a tropical island with my wife and my fortune. He genuinely believed he had thought of absolutely everything. But a thief rarely understands the intricate foundational architecture of the house he has burglarized. As the afternoon stretched on, the ambient noise in the executive suite suddenly shifted. The heavy oak doors swung open, and a hushed, deferential silence fell over the room. Gregory cleared his throat, adopting his most charming, authoritative corporate voice. "Welcome to Chicago, gentlemen," Gregory announced warmly. "Please take a seat. Let us finalize the future of global logistics." The representatives from Apex Holdings had finally arrived. I stopped my cleaning cart in the middle of a deserted hallway, pressing the hidden earpiece deeper into my ear to catch every single syllable. The lead negotiator for the foreign conglomerate spoke with a thick, heavily accented, and utterly uncompromising tone. He was not interested in pleasantries or corporate grandstanding. He immediately bypassed Gregory and his charming introduction, cutting straight to the absolute core of the massive acquisition. Mr. Pierce, the foreign negotiator, began, his voice flat and analytical. "My board of directors is fully prepared to execute the $100 million wire transfer by noon tomorrow. We have reviewed your physical assets, your real estate holdings, and your international shipping contracts. They are acceptable. However, physical trucks and warehouses are entirely replaceable commodities. Apex Holdings is not paying $100 million for your steel and concrete. We are paying for your brain. We are paying for the proprietary artificial intelligence routing algorithm that currently operates your entire global supply chain." I held my breath in the empty hallway, gripping the plastic handle of my mop so tightly my knuckles ached. This was the exact razor-thin precipice I had been waiting for. The routing algorithm was the absolute crown jewel of the entire logistics network. I had spent 5 agonizing years personally coding and refining that specific software alongside a small team of brilliant developers long before Gregory ever stepped foot inside the corporate headquarters. It was the digital nervous system that allowed the company to consistently undercut competitors and maximize delivery efficiency on a global scale. Without that specific algorithm, the entire fleet of trucks was nothing more than a disorganized, wildly expensive liability. Our technical analysts have thoroughly reviewed the source code. The foreign negotiator continued his tone, turning remarkably stern and demanding. "It is undeniably a brilliant piece of software. But before we authorize the final transfer of funds tomorrow, my board requires absolute ironclad assurance regarding the intellectual property rights. We must possess the source code completely free and clear of any external encumbrances, third-party licensing fees, or hidden developmental liens. We demand total ownership. Can you absolutely guarantee that Pierce Global Logistics holds the exclusive unencumbered patents to this artificial intelligence network?" The silence that followed through the hidden microphone was thick and heavy. I could picture Gregory sitting behind my stolen desk, his heart racing with the intoxicating thrill of the impending massive payout. He was a man who understood how to manipulate balance sheets and intimidate middle managers, but he fundamentally lacked the intellectual depth to understand the complex legal architecture I had established when I first founded the empire. He only saw the massive dollar signs flashing brightly in front of his eyes. "You have my absolute, unequivocal guarantee, gentlemen," Gregory finally replied, his voice brimming with a sickening, unearned confidence. "Pierce Global Logistics owns every single line of that proprietary code. We developed it in-house, we patented it under the primary corporate umbrella, and there are absolutely no external claims to the intellectual property. When you sign that contract tomorrow at noon, you will own the algorithm completely and forever. It is entirely yours." "Excellent," the foreign negotiator responded smoothly, the faint sound of a heavy leather briefcase clicking shut echoing through my tiny earpiece. "My legal team will finalize the binding transfer documents tonight. We will see you tomorrow at noon, Mr. Pierce." The heavy oak doors opened and closed again, leaving Gregory and Diana completely alone in the executive suite. I listened as Gregory let out a loud, triumphant shout of pure victory. "We did it," he cheered, his voice echoing wildly across the large room as he joyfully poured 2 massive glasses of vintage champagne. $100 million, Diana. Tomorrow afternoon, we are boarding that plane and leaving this miserable city behind us forever. No one can ever touch us now. We are finally entirely free. I pulled the earpiece out of my ear, the sound of their celebratory laughter fading into the quiet isolation of the empty hallway. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my burner phone. I dialed the only number saved in the directory. Bradley answered on the first ring, his silence an expectant command. A fierce, relentless smile broke across my face, cold and utterly devoid of mercy. "They just stepped right into the trap," I said quietly. "Prepare the blind trust documents immediately." Friday morning arrived with a brilliant, piercing sunlight that washed over the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. The storm clouds from the previous week had completely vanished, leaving behind a crisp, flawless blue sky. Up on the 40th floor of the corporate tower, the atmosphere inside the primary glass-enclosed boardroom was electric. The massive room was a monument to corporate power, featuring a sprawling mahogany table polished to a mirror finish, surrounded by 20 ergonomic leather chairs. At the far end of the room, a sleek wet bar had been fully stocked for a monumental celebration. 3 bottles of rare vintage champagne sat chilling in sterling silver ice buckets, waiting for the final stroke of a pen. Gregory stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city below. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, projecting the absolute image of a victorious titan of industry. Diana sat at the center of the long table wearing a stunning emerald green dress, her posture radiating an arrogant, unearned confidence. Across from them sat the lead negotiator for Apex Holdings, flanked by his aggressive team of international corporate attorneys. Resting exactly in the center of the polished mahogany table was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Inside that folder was the binding acquisition contract, a legally flawless document that would instantly transfer $100 million into Gregory's hidden offshore accounts. The foreign negotiator clicked his expensive pen, ready to finalize the massive transaction. Down in the lower lobby, the pathetic, invisible janitor had officially ceased to exist. I stood in the private executive washroom and stripped off the stained, oversized uniform jacket I had worn for the past month. I discarded the heavy work boots and the faded trousers, leaving the disguise in a crumpled pile on the tiled floor. In their place, I put on the garments Bradley had securely delivered to me earlier that morning. I slid my arms into a custom-tailored, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that fit my shoulders with absolute, uncompromising perfection. I fastened the cuffs of a pristine white silk shirt and adjusted a dark crimson silk tie. I slipped my feet into a pair of handcrafted Italian leather Oxfords that echoed with sharp, commanding authority against the marble floor. When I looked into the expansive mirror above the washroom sink, I did not see the broken ghost Gregory had banished to a rotting wooden shed. I saw Alexander Pierce, the supreme architect of a $50 million empire, completely restored to his rightful state of power. I walked out of the washroom and stepped onto the private executive elevator, pressing the button for the 40th floor. The mechanical hum of the ascending car felt like the rhythmic beating of a war drum. When the polished metal doors finally slid open, I stepped out into the quiet, heavily guarded corridor. The head of corporate security was standing diligently outside the heavy oak doors of the primary boardroom. When he saw me walking down the plush, carpeted hallway in my bespoke suit, his eyes widened in absolute shock, but he did not reach for his weapon. He remembered the highly incriminating video file sitting on my hidden phone. He silently stepped aside, lowering his head in a gesture of total, unwavering submission. I did not acknowledge him. I simply reached out and placed my hands firmly against the heavy brass handles of the double doors. With one smooth, forceful motion, I pushed them wide open. The heavy wood swung inward, with a loud resounding thud that instantly shattered the quiet, tense professionalism of the high-stakes meeting. The foreign attorneys stopped shuffling their legal documents. The lead negotiator froze his expensive pen, hovering just an inch above the signature line. Diana let out a sharp, terrified gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Gregory spun around from the towering glass windows, his charming, victorious smile completely evaporating from his face. For a long, agonizing moment, the entire room was plunged into a suffocating, paralyzing silence. Gregory stared at me, his eyes frantically scanning my tailored suit, my confident posture, and the cold, unforgiving expression on my face. His brain struggled to process the impossible reality standing before him. He was completely conditioned to see a trembling, defeated old man pushing a yellow mop bucket. Seeing me restored to my absolute prime, radiating dangerous authority, violently short-circuited his arrogant mind. "Alexander," he stammered, his deep voice cracking under the sudden, immense weight of his own panic. "What in the world are you doing in here? You are completely unauthorized to be on this floor. Get out of this room immediately before I have you arrested for trespassing." I did not retreat. I stepped fully into the spacious boardroom, my expensive leather shoes echoing sharply against the polished hardwood floor. I ignored Gregory entirely, focusing my gaze directly on the foreign lead negotiator sitting at the center of the massive table. "I advise you to put that pen down, sir," I said, my voice projecting a calm, lethal resonance that commanded absolute obedience. "You are about to sign a legally binding contract with a man who does not possess the fundamental authority to sell you this company." The lead negotiator frowned deeply, exchanging a very confused, irritated glance with his aggressive legal team. Gregory completely lost his composure. His face turned a dark, furious shade of crimson. He slammed his fists down onto the mahogany table, shattering the illusion of the calm, sophisticated executive. "This is an absolute outrage," Gregory roared violently, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This man is a convicted federal felon. He is a deranged former employee who has completely lost his grip on reality. Do not listen to a single word he says." He turned his furious gaze toward the open double doors, his chest heaving with desperate, uncontrollable rage. "Security!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing frantically down the executive corridor. "Security! Get in here right now and physically remove this lunatic from the building. I demand that you throw him out immediately." The head of corporate security stepped into the doorway. Gregory let out a sigh of relief, expecting his highly paid muscle to instantly tackle me to the ground. But the security chief did not look at me. He looked directly at Gregory, his expression completely blank and devoid of any loyalty. The guard then slowly reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handles of the double doors. He pulled them shut, stepping backward into the hallway. The loud, definitive click of the heavy deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the silent boardroom. The guard had locked the doors from the outside, perfectly sealing everyone inside the glass enclosure. Gregory stared at the locked doors in absolute paralyzing horror. The color completely drained from his face as he finally realized he was entirely trapped in a cage of his own making. I slowly walked to the head of the mahogany table, resting my hands firmly on the polished wood. "The ghost is gone, Gregory," I whispered deeply. "We are done playing this foolish game forever." "My turn." Gregory stood perfectly still at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table. The sudden sound of the heavy deadbolt clicking into place had momentarily frozen the breath in his lungs. As he looked at me standing alone in my tailored charcoal suit, his initial shock rapidly warped into a deeply toxic, arrogant sneer. He truly believed he still held the absolute high ground in this room. He looked at the powerful foreign negotiators sitting beside him, then back at me, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. "You really think locking a door changes anything at all?" Alexander Gregory taunted, taking a slow, profoundly arrogant step forward. "You have no money, no power, and no legal standing to even be on this property. You are a convicted felon, trespassing in my building, interrupting a sensitive transaction. As soon as that door unlocks, you are going straight back to a concrete cell for the rest of your miserable life." I maintained a cold expression, as I walked slowly down the length of the immaculate mahogany table. The international attorneys representing the foreign conglomerate watched me in total silence, their expensive pens hovering over their leather portfolios. Diana pressed her back firmly against her chair, her hands trembling violently as she clutched the fabric of her dress. She could sense the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. I stopped directly in front of the lead negotiator. He stared up at me, clearly demanding an explanation for this corporate interruption. I reached inside the pocket of my custom suit and slowly pulled out a bright red legal folder. I placed the red folder directly on top of the $100 million acquisition contract. Gregory let out another harsh, condescending scoff from across the massive room. "What is that supposed to be, Alexander?" he asked, aggressively crossing his arms over his chest. "Are you trying to hand out your pathetic janitorial resume to our new international business partners? You are embarrassing yourself in front of very important people. I highly suggest you turn around and walk away before you make this situation any worse for yourself." I completely ignored Gregory. I kept my eyes locked firmly on the lead negotiator. "I highly advise you to open that red folder and read the primary executive summary before you sign a single document in this room today," I instructed smoothly, my voice projecting an absolute unshakable authority. "Because if you transfer $100 million into my brother's offshore bank accounts this afternoon, your board of directors is going to fire you for orchestrating the most disastrous financial acquisition in your company's corporate history." The lead negotiator frowned deeply. He shot a highly irritated, questioning glance toward Gregory, who was now suddenly gripping the edge of the mahogany table, a fresh wave of panic visibly rising in his chest. The foreign executive slowly reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the red legal folder. He scanned the heavily notarized legal documents. As his eyes tracked down the pages, the color completely drained from his stern face. He looked back up at me, his expression morphing into one of profound, absolute shock. "This cannot possibly be accurate." The lead negotiator whispered, his voice completely devoid of its former demanding arrogance. He aggressively turned the folder around and pushed it toward his team of aggressive international attorneys. "Verify these patent registrations right now." Gregory stepped forward, his breathing turning ragged and entirely uncontrolled. "What is in that folder?" he demanded, his voice cracking violently under the immense, crushing weight of the unknown. I finally turned my head to look directly at the man who had stolen my entire existence. I did not give him a look of hatred or anger. I gave him a look of pure, unadulterated, clinical detachment. 15 years ago, Gregory I, began, my voice cold and echoing across the silent boardroom, when I developed the artificial intelligence routing algorithm that completely automated our global supply chain network. I made a very specific legal decision. I knew that the logistics software was infinitely more valuable than the actual physical fleet of delivery trucks or the concrete storage warehouses. The algorithm was the supreme, undeniable crown jewel of the entire operation. Gregory stared at me, his tense jaw trembling as the realization began to claw its way into his arrogant mind. I did not patent that routing algorithm under the primary corporate umbrella of Pierce Global Logistics. I continued, deliberately slowing my words to ensure every single syllable struck him like a physical blow. I patented the entire source code under a completely separate, entirely anonymous holding company named Titan Dynamics. I established a blind trust to securely shield my absolute ownership of that specific intellectual property. Pierce Global Logistics never actually owned the artificial intelligence software that makes this company profitable. The logistics company simply leased the operational rights to the algorithm from Titan Dynamics for exactly $1 a year. Diana let out a quiet gasp from her chair, her eyes widening in absolute terror. She understood the sheer magnitude of the trap they had blindly walked into. "Which means," I said, turning my gaze back to the terrified foreign negotiator, "when my brother illegally seized control of Pierce Global Logistics 12 years ago, he only took control of a hollow shell. He owns a depreciating fleet of rusting delivery trucks, a collection of aging warehouses, and a massive stack of standard shipping contracts. But he does not own the digital brain that makes the entire logistics network function. He never did. Gregory stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the pristine hardwood floor. He violently shook his head, refusing to accept the destruction of his escape plan. "No," he shouted, his voice echoing frantically. "That is a complete lie. You are just trying to ruin my life out of pure bitter jealousy." The lead foreign attorney looked up from the red folder. He turned to his boss and nodded slowly. "The intellectual property filings are absolutely legitimate, sir," the attorney confirmed coldly. "Pierce Global Logistics does not possess the source code. The algorithmic patents belong exclusively to Titan Dynamics." I placed both of my hands firmly on the polished mahogany table and leaned forward, looking directly into the eyes of the foreign buyers. "As the sole owner of Titan Dynamics," I said, delivering the final lethal blow with absolute precision, "I am officially revoking the software licensing agreement with Pierce Global Logistics, effective immediately. You are buying a $100 million pile of scrap metal." The boardroom descended into absolute pandemonium. He grabbed the acquisition contract he had been prepared to sign. With a look of pure disgust directed entirely at Gregory, he violently tore the binding document in half, tossing the shredded pieces onto the table. "We are absolutely done here," he barked, snapping his briefcase shut. The foreign buyers pushed their chairs back violently, storming toward the locked double doors and aggressively pounding on the heavy brass handles until the security chief finally opened them. They marched out of the room without looking back, taking Gregory's stolen $100 million fortune away with them. But it was not over yet.